after the National Banking Acts of 1862 and 1863. The next major piece of legislation that you had was the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. Now, the only thing federal about the Federal Reserve Act is the name federal, because it is not government run and it is owned by a board of private individuals who are not named. These individuals who are not named get to control interest rates, the money supply, and the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate, for those of you that are unfamiliar, is the rate that the Fed loans your community bank. And as a result, that plays a role, a more than significant role, in the percentage that you pay to borrow money. Now, what you must understand is that our system is a debt-based system. Every dollar that is printed into circulation has debt attached to it. When the bank prints $1 and loans it out to you, you owe $1 and change. And the money you put into the bank uses it to loan to other people, which creates a giant house of cards, a massive debt that must be paid back at interest. And like I stated in my first video, it's not like they're producing a hamburger, fixing your car, or providing a service or good that you want. They are printing money out of thin air, loaning to you at interest, and you must pay that interest back. So these bankers met at one of JP Morgan's private islands. It was called Jekyll Island. Now, this island was so exclusive and so private that the individuals attending the meeting could only be referred to by their first names. It was the usual suspects, the members of the Illuminati bloodline: John D. Rockefeller, J. Pierpont Morgan, the Warburgs, individuals like that. And then they used Nelson Aldrich, who was a senator who was instrumental in getting the bill passed. Nelson Aldrich later on married into the Rockefeller family. What this act did was give the bankers control over interest rates, federal fund rates, the money supply, and so on and so forth. But that wasn't enough for them, because you still had other banks that were competing against them. That is why they had to go through the problem, reaction, solution. And that problem, which caused the reaction, and then the solution, was the Great Depression. Now, here's some facts about the Great Depression. What you will commonly hear historians refer to as Black Tuesday, which was the fourth and last day of the crash, was on October 29th, 1929. Investors traded a record 16.4 million shares. They lost $14 billion on the New York Stock Exchange, worth $206 billion in 2019 dollars. During the 4 days of the crash, the Dow Jones average dropped 25%, and investors lost $30 billion. This was 10 times more than the 1929 federal budget. It was more than the United States had spent on World War I. So all of that money they used to pay the soldiers, the defense contractors, the gasoline they used to run the tanks and the airplanes, all of that money was less than the amount lost by the private individuals in the market during the Great Depression. After the crash, stock prices continued falling. On November 13, 1929, they hit their bottom for the year. By then, more than $100 billion had disappeared from the American economy. The Dow didn't regain its pre-crash high until November 23, 1954. Unemployment rose to 25% at its highest level, which is 15 million Americans, and didn't drop below 10% until after the country entered World War II in December 1941. What's crazy about this is I remember during the Obama years when unemployment was like at 7 or 8%, which is high comparatively, but people were like, oh my gosh, 7 and 8% unemployment, 9% unemployment, but it was 15%, which is the highest it's ever been during the Great Depression. From 1914 to 1919, so this, right now I'm about to get into the bankers that caused this. These are the facts of the Depression. So from 1914 to 1919, which was 1913 was when the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. The Fed increased the money supply by nearly 100%, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then in 1920, the Fed called in these loans, resulting in 54 banks outside of the Fed collapsing, resulting in a monopoly of a small group owning the supply of money. That was just a warm-up, however. From 1921 to 1929, the Fed increased the money supply by 62%, once again giving extensive loans to the public and banks. There was also a fairly new loan called a margin loan, which was in the stock market. Very simple. A margin loan allowed an investor to only have to put down 10% for a stock, with the rest of the 90% being paid for with loans from a broker. In other words, a person could own $1,000 worth of stock with only $100 down. Putting this in the most simplistic terms possible, if you wanted to own $100 worth of stock, you could pay 10 cents, and the stockbroker would make up the rest of the 90 cents that it would cost you. This was very popular in the roaring 1920s, as seemingly everyone seemed to be making money in the market. The catch to this loan, however, was that it could be called in any time and had to be paid within hours. This was called a margin call. Typically, the result of a margin call was the selling of the stock with the loan. A few months before October 1929, J.D. Rockefeller, Bernard Baruch, Paul Warburg, and the usual suspects quietly exited the market. In October 1929, the bankers who issued the loans started calling them in mass. This sparked a massive instantaneous sell-off, which triggered failures to pay off loans, resulting in massive bank failures of over 16,000 banks, which allowed insiders to buy off rival banks at a discount and entire corporations for pennies on the dollar. See, it's all about consolidating power, gaining control of the supply of money, getting rid of the competitors. Rather than expanding the money supply to recover from this economic crash, they contracted it, therefore, taking money out of circulation. And since there was no money circulating, because this is how it works, the bank loans money out to Paul. Paul uses that money to get a loan from the bank on a house or a car, a percentage of that to have food at the local diner, and it circulates, right? Well, since the Fed loaned out all this money to individuals, called in those loans, people sold off those loans, the banks did not have enough money to pay for those loans, and so they were forced to sell themselves off. The bankers bought those banks, the large bankers, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, people in that elite club, And then they did not print out money. They lowered the money supply, so there was no money in circulation. Therefore, there was no money to pay back the loans. And what's crazy about it is during this period, as I have stated extensively in this series, there were factories that were perfectly fine, that were just rotting away. There was milk that was thrown into sewers because the government put price control on that milk. So those resources were going to waste. You still had roads, bridges, able-bodied individuals. But since there was no money in the money supply, it was impossible to exchange goods. And that's why you had hundreds and hundreds of people, even millions of people, that were waiting in the bread lines when there were factories that were perfectly usable, rotting away on the side of the street. And then all of a sudden, when World War II happened, those factories became operational. And that's sort of what ended the Depression, was that the war started. So individuals were put back to work for the war effort. Now, I've heard a hypothesis that this is similar to the broken window theory. That the theory is as follows. It's an economic theory. That if you break someone's window and then they spend that money repairing the window, then you are not growing the economy. Rather, that money that they use fixing the window would be used on another area, such as going to the movies, going to McDonald's, buying new furniture for your home. So basically, the hypothesis is not that that was growing the economy, but you were using that in another area. And I tend to think this the same way. Now, we had to defeat Hitler and the Nazis. I am not disputing that fact. The only fact that I'm disputing is that that got us out of the war. The notion that World War II got us out of the war, we could have used that money in alternative areas. We could have used that money to feed people, to open the factories, so on and so forth. But instead, we used it for the war effort. Not much of a choice, but the only thing I'm arguing is that the war got us out of the Depression. There was a congressman, though, named Louis McFadden. He drew up legislation to impeach the board of the Federal Reserve. There were 2 assassination attempts against McFadden, but they failed. But later on, he was poisoned at a banquet, and the legislation was scrapped. Any individual that tries to get in the way of their money supply is destroyed, is killed, ceases to exist. So now that I explained how the Federal Reserve was established, what it means, how the bankers caused the Depression, I will get into a few more notes. The Bretton Woods system, Nixon's gold shock, and other things of that nature in the next video.